In the unforgiving heat of the 1870s Arizona Territory, where the dust settles on secrets and the law is a whisper in the wind, a lone widow's life is about to be shattered. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a saga of two worlds colliding with the force of a flash flood. When a woman who has lost everything stumbles upon a wounded girl from a legendary, uncontacted Amazonian tribe deep within the unforgiving rainforest, she unleashes a storm of consequences. Forget what you know about the West. This is a tale of desperate courage, a relentless manhunt, and a mother's love so fierce it brings an army of warriors to the doorstep of a forgotten world, not for war, but for a celebration that will shake the very foundations of the frontier. The sun beat down on the Arizona Territory with a merciless white-hot intensity that bleached the very color from the sky. For Thea Hayes, the heat was a constant oppressive companion, a physical weight that mirrored the grief she'd carried for 2 years since her husband Jacob had been taken by a fever. Their homestead, a stubborn speck of life, carved out of the unforgiving landscape near the edge of the sprawling, mysterious rainforest known locally as the Green Hell, was all she had left of him. It was a place of both solace and profound loneliness, a daily reminder of a shared dream now solely her burden. The year was 1875. The world was churning with change, with whispers of railroads and new settlements, but out here, life was stripped to its essentials: water, food, and the eternal struggle against the elements. Thea, a woman rendered prematurely stern by hardship, had learned to read the land with an acuity born of necessity. She knew the language of the wind, the subtle shifts in the behavior of the coyotes, and the telltale signs of a coming dust storm. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon. She'd been tracking a wayward goat, one of her precious few, that had wandered off towards the dense, almost impenetrable wall of the rainforest. It was a place the other settlers, the handful of families clustered miles away in the fledgling town of Redemption, avoided. They spoke of it in hushed tones, trading stories of strange creatures, disorienting mists, and the lingering ghosts of Spanish prospectors who had ventured in and never returned. Jacob had called it the Viridian Sea, fascinated by its raw, untamed beauty, but even he had respected its dangers. The goat's tracks led her deeper than she'd ever dared to go alone. The air grew thick and humid, a stark contrast to the arid heat of her homestead. The cacophony of the desert, the buzz of insects, the cry of a distant hawk, was replaced by a symphony of unfamiliar sounds: the chattering of monkeys, the piercing calls of exotic birds, and a low, continuous hum that seemed to emanate from the very soil. Giant ferns, lush and impossibly green, brushed against her worn leather riding skirt, and the canopy of trees formed a dense ceiling that dappled the light, casting strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was in a small, sun-drenched clearing, a pocket of stillness amidst the vibrant chaos, that she found her. At first, Thea thought it was a deer, a flash of brown and red against the verdant backdrop. But then she saw the unmistakable shape of a human form curled into a fetal position near the gnarled roots of an ancient ironwood tree. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her first instinct, honed by years of frontier caution, was to retreat. This was the territory of the Apache, and though the local bands had kept a fragile peace, a lone woman was a vulnerable target. But as she watched, the form stirred with a pained whimper, a sound so young and full of suffering that it bypassed her fear and went straight to the dormant maternal instincts buried beneath her grief. Slowly, cautiously, she approached her hand, resting on the handle of the Bowie knife Jacob had given her. The figure was a young girl, no older than 12 or 13. Her skin was a rich, coppery brown, adorned with intricate swirling patterns of black and red paint that seemed to follow the contours of her muscles. She wore a simple loincloth of woven fibers and a necklace of polished seeds and what looked like monkey teeth. Her hair, a cascade of thick black silk, was matted with blood. The source of the blood was a vicious gash on her leg, a deep, angry wound that ran from her thigh to her knee. It was caked with dirt and leaves, clearly festering in the oppressive humidity, but it was the other wound that made Thea's breath catch in her throat. Embedded in the girl's shoulder, perilously close to her neck, was a crudely made arrow, its fletching unlike any she had ever seen. This was not Apache. This was something else entirely. The girl's eyes fluttered open. They were the most astonishing eyes Thea had ever seen, a startling shade of green, like polished jade, and they fixed on her with a mixture of terror and fierce, untamed pride. She tried to scramble away, crab-walking backward, her painted face contorting in a grimace of pain. She hissed a sound, more animal than human, and bared a set of perfect white teeth. "Easy now," Thea said, her voice soft, trying to project a calm she was far from feeling. She held up her hands, palms open to show she meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're hurt. You need help." The girl, of course, didn't understand her words. She responded with a torrent of guttural sounds, a language that was as wild and alien as the forest around them. It was a rhythmic, melodic tongue, but her tone was one of pure defiance. Thea knew she had a choice. She could leave. She could turn her back, return to the relative safety of her homestead, and pretend she had seen nothing. It was the sensible thing to do. The girl was a mystery, a potential danger. Her people, whoever they were, could be nearby. But then she looked at the festering wound on the girl's leg, the unnatural angle of the arrow in her shoulder, and the feverish glaze that was beginning to cloud those magnificent green eyes. She saw not a savage, but a child, alone and in agony. And in that moment, the loneliness of her own life, the vast echoing emptiness of her cabin, became unbearable. "All right, little one," she murmured, more to herself than to the girl. "Looks like we're in this together." Getting the girl back to the homestead was an ordeal. She was light but wiry and strong, and she fought Thea's attempts to help her with a surprising ferocity even in her weakened state. It was a slow, agonizing process. Thea had to half carry, half drag her through the dense undergrowth, all the while speaking in a low, soothing monotone, the way she used to with a frightened colt. By the time they emerged from the tree line, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The girl, whose name Thea did not know, had finally succumbed to the fever, her body limp and burning to the touch. Thea's goat was waiting patiently by the cabin door, a comical, bleating sentinel in the face of the unfolding drama. Inside the small one-room cabin, the air was cool and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. Thea laid the girl gently on her own bed, a simple mattress stuffed with corn husks, and for the first time got a proper look at her. She was exquisitely made, with fine, delicate features that contrasted with the fierce warrior paint. The patterns on her skin were not random. They were a tapestry of symbols, a visual language that spoke of a culture and a world utterly alien to Thea's own. Her first priority was the arrow. Removing it was a risk, but leaving it in was a death sentence. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She sterilized her knife, in the flame of a lantern, the metal glowing a dull red. The girl moaned, her body twitching, lost in the delirium of the fever. "I'm sorry," Thea whispered, her heart aching. "This is going to hurt." She cut away the fabric of the loincloth around the shoulder, exposing the point of entry. The arrowhead was barbed, made of sharpened bone. It would tear the flesh if she simply pulled it out. Gritting her teeth, she pushed the arrow the rest of the way through a brutal but necessary act. The girl screamed a raw, piercing cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Her back arched in agony, and then she fell limp, unconscious. With trembling hands, Thea broke off the arrowhead and carefully, slowly drew the shaft back out. Blood, dark and sluggish, welled from both wounds. Thea worked quickly, her movements precise and practiced from years of tending to injured livestock. She cleaned the wounds with whiskey, a precious commodity she saved for medicinal purposes, and the girl's body shuddered at the stinging contact. Then she applied a poultice of comfrey and yarrow herbs she grew in a small garden behind the cabin and bound the wounds tightly with clean strips of linen torn from one of her own chemises. The gash on the leg was even more gruesome. It was inflamed and swollen, the skin around it a deep, angry red. Thea spent the better part of an hour cleaning it meticulously, removing every speck of dirt and debris. As she worked, she talked, her voice a low, steady murmur. She told the girl about Jacob, about their dream of building a life in this harsh but beautiful land. She talked about the goat and the chickens and the stubborn little patch of corn she was trying to grow. She didn't know if the sound of her voice offered any comfort, but it calmed her own frayed nerves. For 3 days and 3 nights, Thea did not leave the girl's side. She was her prisoner and her patient. She spooned broth and water between her parched lips, bathed her fevered brow with cool water, and changed the dressings on her wounds. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes thrashing and crying out in her strange tongue, her jade-green eyes wide with a terror that saw past Thea to some unseen horror. In her delirium, she repeated one word over and over again, a soft melodic sound that Thea eventually came to recognize. Lyra. She decided it must be her name. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Thea woke from a fitful doze in her rocking chair to find Lyra watching her, her eyes clear and lucid for the first time. The terror was gone, replaced by a wary, intelligent curiosity. She was weak, but the defiance was back, a spark of untamed fire in the depths of her gaze. Thea offered her a cup of water, and this time Lyra accepted it, her small, delicate hand wrapping around the tin cup. She drank greedily, then pushed the cup away, her eyes never leaving Thea's face. A silent, fragile truce had been forged between them, a bond of necessity and shared vulnerability in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Thea had saved a life, but as she looked at the mysterious painted girl in her bed, a girl who belonged to a world she could not begin to comprehend, she had a chilling premonition that her act of compassion had not been an ending, but a beginning. She had pulled a stranger from the jaws of death, and in doing so, she had unwittingly invited the wild, unpredictable heart of the rainforest into her home. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the world outside her cabin door would never be the same again. The quiet, lonely life of the widow Thea Hayes was over. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air, a gathering storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Weeks bled into a month. The fierce heat of summer began to yield almost imperceptibly to the drier, more forgiving air of early autumn. a routine as strange and unique as the girl herself settled over Thea's homestead. Lyra, as Thea now called her, healed with a speed that was nothing short of astonishing. The wounds that would have laid a grown man low for months seemed to knit themselves together with an almost supernatural vitality. The warrior spirit that had been dulled by pain and fever returned in full force. Communication was a slow, painstaking dance of gesture and mimicry. Lyra was a quick study, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. She learned the names of the objects in the cabin, cup, bed, fire, with a rapacious curiosity. Thea, in turn, began to understand the nuances of Lyra's melodic language, recognizing tones of question, of affirmation, of warning. A bond deep and unspoken grew between them. It was a bond forged in the quiet moments, the shared meal of cornbread and goat's milk, the silent companionship, as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars blaze to life in the vast, dark sky. Lyra, for her part, began to reveal a world that Thea had only glimpsed in the fevered dreams of prospectors. She showed Thea how to find edible roots and tubers in the seemingly barren soil, how to read the subtle tracks of animals Thea had never known existed. She moved with a fluid, silent grace, a creature of the wilderness in a way Thea, for all her years on the frontier, could never be. She would often stand at the edge of the property, her gaze fixed on the dense wall of the rainforest, a look of profound, aching longing on her face. Thea understood. She was a long way from home, but the idyll of their strange, shared existence was a fragile bubble, and Thea knew it. The arrow that had pierced Lyra's shoulder was a constant nagging reminder that she was not just lost, she was hunted. Who had shot her, and why? The questions hung in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. The answer to those questions was riding towards them on a dust-caked horse, a man whose reputation was as grim and unyielding as the landscape he traversed. His name was Silas Kane, though most men knew him only as the Vulture. He was a bounty hunter, but he specialized in a peculiar and highly lucrative trade, the acquisition of exotics for wealthy collectors back east and in Europe. He was a man devoid of conscience, with eyes the color of faded denim, and a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-dried leather. He was patient, relentless, and he never ever gave up on a quarry. Silas had been on Lyra's trail for weeks. He had been commissioned by a man of immense wealth and influence, a railroad baron named Alistair Finch, who had a morbid fascination with the undiscovered peoples of the world. Finch didn't just want artifacts, he wanted live specimens, and he paid a king's ransom for them. Silas had been tracking a small band of what he called Green Hell Indians, a tribe so elusive they were considered little more than a myth. He had ambushed them, hoping to capture one alive, but they had fought back with a ferocity he had not anticipated. In the chaotic skirmish, he had managed to wound one, a young girl. But she had escaped into the dense rainforest, a place even he was loath to enter. But Silas was nothing if not meticulous. He had found the tracks faint as they were leading out of the forest. He had followed them to the edge of the settled territory, a place most trackers would have given up. And then, in the dusty one-street town of Redemption, he had heard the whispers. A lone widow, a recluse living out by the Green Hell, had been seen buying more supplies than usual, including expensive medicines. It was a thread, a tiny, insignificant loose end, but it was enough for a man like Silas Kane. He rode out to the Hayes homestead under the guise of a weary traveler, seeking water for his horse. Thea's heart seized when she saw him approaching, a tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. She had seen men like him before, men who lived by the gun and the cold, hard calculus of survival. She immediately sent Lyra inside with a sharp, whispered word of warning. "Afternoon, ma'am, Silas," said his voice, a low, gravelly drawl that grated on Thea's nerves. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his washed-out eyes scanning every detail of the homestead, the well-tended garden, the sturdy cabin, the single set of tracks leading to the door. "Can I help you?" Thea asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that was coiling in her stomach. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her body language a clear, unmistakable barrier. "Just need to water my horse, if you don't mind," he said, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Long ride from Tucson." Thea nodded curtly towards the trough. "Help yourself." As his horse drank, Silas leaned against the fence, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "Quiet out here," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Just you, just me," Thea said, her voice flat. "Heard stories about this place," he continued, undeterred. "They say the forest coughs things up sometimes. Strange things." He looked directly at her, his eyes probing, searching. "Ever see anything unusual?" The air crackled with unspoken tension. Thea could feel Lyra's presence inside the cabin, a silent, terrified witness to this dangerous interrogation. She knew that one wrong word, one flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, would be enough to confirm his suspicions. "The only thing unusual out here is a man who asks too many questions," she said, her voice laced with ice. "Water your horse and be on your way." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Feisty," he said, pushing himself off the fence. "I like that." He tipped his hat. "Much obliged for the water, ma'am." He mounted his horse and rode off, but he didn't go far. Thea watched him until he was a speck in the distance, but she was not fooled. He had seen something, or sensed something, that had piqued his interest. He was a predator, and he had caught the scent of his prey. That night, an atmosphere of dread settled over the cabin. Lyra, who had understood the danger in Silas's voice, even if she hadn't understood the words, was agitated. She paced the small room like a caged animal, her green eyes wide with a primal fear. She kept touching the scar on her shoulder, a phantom ache that was more than just a memory of physical pain. Thea knew they couldn't stay. Silas would be back. It was only a matter of time. She began to pack a desperate, frantic inventory of their meager possessions. A little food, a canteen of water, her husband's rifle, and a box of precious cartridges. But where could they go? The town of Redemption was out of the question. Silas had already been there. The open desert was a death sentence. Their only hope, as ironic and terrifying as it was the one place Lyra had been so desperate to return, to the rainforest. As she packed, her hand brushed against Jacob's old journal, a leather-bound book filled with his observations and sketches of the surrounding wilderness. He had been fascinated by the stories of the Green Hell Indians, and he had spent months trying to map the edges of their territory. He had written of a hidden canyon, a place of strange rock formations, and a natural spring, a place so well concealed that one could walk right by it without ever knowing it was there. He had called it Echo Canyon. It was a long shot, a ghost of a hope based on a dead man's obsession, but it was the only one they had. They left under the cover of darkness, two fugitives slipping away into the night. Thea left the goat and the chickens. They would fend for themselves. She took one last look at the cabin, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky, a monument to a life that was now gone forever. A profound sadness washed over her, a grief for the home she had fought so hard to maintain. But then she looked at Lyra, her small, determined face illuminated by the moonlight, and she knew she had made the right choice. Their journey was a desperate flight into the unknown. The rainforest, which had been a place of healing and discovery, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Thea's veins. Was it Silas? Or was it something else, something even more dangerous? They traveled for 2 days, guided by Thea's memory of Jacob's crude maps and Lyra's innate, almost mystical connection to the wilderness. Lyra moved with a silent, sure-footed confidence, her senses on high alert. She was no longer a patient. She was a guide, a protector. The roles had reversed, and Thea, the hardened frontier widow, was now the one who was out of her element. On the 3rd day, as despair was beginning to set in, Lyra stopped. She pointed to a wall of rock, a sheer, unremarkable cliff face covered in vines and moss. Thea saw nothing, but Lyra insisted, pulling at her arm, her voice urgent. Thea, trusting the girl's instincts, pushed aside a thick curtain of vines and gasped. It was just as Jacob had described it, a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It opened up into a small, sunken canyon, a hidden oasis in the heart of the jungle. A crystal-clear spring bubbled up from the ground, feeding a small pool surrounded by lush, exotic flowers. The air was cool and still, and the sounds of the jungle were muffled distant. It was a sanctuary. It was Echo Canyon. They were safe for now. But as they huddled together in their hidden refuge, listening to the faint, echoing calls of the jungle, a new, more terrifying thought began to take root in Thea's mind. Silas Kane was not a man to be trifled with. He had a reputation for being almost supernaturally persistent, and he was working for someone else, a man with the resources to fund an exhaustive, relentless search. Her act of compassion, her decision to save a single wounded child, had not just put her own life in danger. It had set her on a collision course with forces far more powerful and ruthless than a lone bounty hunter. She had stumbled into a conflict she did not understand, a secret war being waged in the shadows of the frontier, and she was beginning to suspect that Lyra was not just any girl from an unknown tribe. She was something more, something important, something worth killing for. The sanctuary of Echo Canyon was only a temporary reprieve. The storm she had felt gathering was not just coming, it was upon them, and it was about to break with a fury that would change the face of the territory forever. The sanctuary of Echo Canyon was a world unto itself. Days were marked by the slow crawl of sunlight across the canyon walls, and nights were filled with the gentle, rhythmic chorus of nocturnal creatures. For the first time in a long while, Thea felt a fragile sense of peace. The constant gnawing fear of Silas Kane's pursuit began to recede, replaced by the simple, immediate demands of survival. With Lyra as her guide, the canyon provided for them. They ate wild fruits and roasted lizards and drank the pure, cold water from the spring. It was during this time that the true nature of their bond was forged. With the threat of the outside world held at bay, the barriers between them, the ones of language and culture, began to dissolve. Lyra, with the patient, methodical focus of a natural teacher, began to teach Thea her language. It was a language of clicks and soft, guttural vowels, a language that was as much a part of the rainforest as the rustling leaves and the flowing water. Thea, in turn, read to Lyra from Jacob's journal, the English words strange and alien in the confines of the canyon, but the stories of his love for the land, his awe at its beauty, were a language that Lyra seemed to understand intuitively. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lyra pointed to the intricate patterns on her skin, the ones that had so fascinated Thea when she had first found her. She touched a swirling sun-like symbol on her arm and said a word in her language, a word that sounded like Inti. Then she pointed to the sky, to the last fading rays of the setting sun. Thea understood. Inti was the sun. Lyra then traced a more complex pattern on her chest, a design that incorporated the sun symbol with the image of a great soaring bird. She said another word, a word that was longer, more reverent. Inti-Tiamat. She then touched her own chest, and then Thea's, a gesture of profound significance. Slowly, haltingly, through a combination of her burgeoning vocabulary and expressive gestures, she began to tell her story. She was not just a girl from an unknown tribe. She was the daughter of the tribe's chieftain, a woman renowned for her wisdom and her strength. The name of their people was the Inti-Tiamat, the children of the sun serpent, a creature of myth that was both of the earth and the sky. They were a people who had lived in the heart of the green hell for generations, a people who had a sacred duty to protect the forest from those who would seek to exploit it. The arrow that had struck her had not been from a rival tribe. It had been from the metal men, as she called them, men who came with fire sticks and a cold, insatiable hunger for the yellow rock that lay buried in their sacred lands. Silas Cain. He and his men had ambushed her and her father while they were on a ceremonial hunt. Her father had fought to protect her, giving her time to escape, but he had been overwhelmed. She did not know if he was alive or dead. The revelation hit Thea with the force of a physical blow. The abstract danger she had sensed had now taken on a concrete, terrifying form. This was not about a single kidnapped girl for a rich man's collection. This was about something far more valuable, far more dangerous: gold. The stories of lost Spanish mines, the whispers that had always hung at the edges of the territory, were true. And Alistair Finch, the railroad baron, was not just a collector of human exotica. He was a ruthless industrialist who would stop at nothing to secure his fortune. He wasn't just trying to build a railroad, he was trying to plunder a secret kingdom. Their peaceful interlude in Echo Canyon was shattered. The sanctuary had become a cage. They were trapped, caught between a relentless hunter and a powerful unseen enemy. Lyra was no longer just a hunted girl. She was the key to a treasure that could tear the territory apart. The vulture, meanwhile, was growing impatient. Silas Cain was not a man who enjoyed being thwarted. He had lost the girl's trail at the edge of the rainforest, a place he despised. It was a chaotic, disorganized wilderness, a place that defied the cold, hard logic he applied to his hunts. But he was a patient man. He made his camp at the edge of the forest, a grim, solitary sentinel, and he began to do what he did best. He watched and he listened. He spent his days systematically exploring the perimeter of the forest, his washed-out eyes missing nothing. He was looking for a sign, a mistake, a flicker of movement that would betray their hiding place. He knew they were in there. He could feel it, a hunter's intuition that had never failed him. His break came, as it so often did, from the carelessness of others. A pair of prospectors drawn by the same rumors of gold that had attracted Alistair Finch blundered into his camp one evening. They were half-starved and spooked, their eyes wide, with a combination of greed and terror. They told a rambling, disjointed story of getting lost in the green hell, of wandering for days in a disorienting maze of trees and vines. And then They told him about the canyon. They had stumbled upon it by accident, a hidden cleft in the rock. They had seen a spring and signs of a recent campfire. And they had heard a voice, a woman's voice, speaking in a strange guttural language. They had been too scared to investigate, fleeing back into the jungle in a panic. But they had given Silas all he needed, a hidden canyon, a woman's voice. He knew with absolute certainty that he had found them. The attack came at dawn. The first sign of trouble was a sound that did not belong in the tranquil harmony of the canyon, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Thea and Lyra, who had been sleeping by the dying embers of their fire, were instantly awake. They saw him at the same time, a dark, gaunt figure standing at the entrance to the canyon, blocking their only escape route. Silas Kane. "Morning, ladies," he said, his voice a low, chilling drawl that echoed off the canyon walls. "Nice little spot you got here. Cozy." He was not alone. Behind him stood two other men, rough-looking characters with the hard, pitiless eyes of hired guns. They were holding rifles, their aim steady and unwavering. Thea's mind raced. Her own rifle was leaning against the rock face, a few feet away, an impossible distance. They were trapped, cornered. "It's over, ma'am," Silas said, taking a step into the canyon. "Don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be. The girl comes with me. You can walk away. No one has to get hurt." But Thea knew he was lying. He had seen her face. She was a witness. He couldn't let her live. Lyra, however, was not cowering. She stood tall, her small body radiating a defiant energy that was breathtaking to behold. She let out a string of words in her own language, her voice clear and strong, a challenge, not a plea. Silas chuckled. "She's got spirit," he said. "Mr. Finch will like that. He pays extra for spirit." And then something extraordinary happened. As Silas took another step forward, Lyra raised her head to the sky and let out a piercing, high-pitched cry. It was not a scream of fear. It was a call, a signal, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It was a sound that carried, that echoed, that seemed to penetrate the rock walls of the canyon and reach out into the vast green wilderness beyond. Silas hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. "What was that?" he snarled. "What did you do?" Lyra just smiled, a fierce, triumphant smile that transformed her face. And then they heard it, a low, growing rumble, like distant thunder. But it wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from the earth. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. It grew louder, closer, a sound of raw, primal power. The two hired guns exchanged nervous glances, their rifles wavering. "What is that, boss?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. Silas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the top of the canyon walls, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. And then they appeared, silhouetted against the morning sky, lining the rim of the canyon, were figures, dozens of them, warriors. Their bodies were covered in the same intricate patterns as Lyra's, their faces painted with the fierce, intimidating visage of the sun serpent. They were armed with bows and long obsidian-tipped spears. They were silent, motionless, a terrifying, beautiful army of ghosts materialized from the very heart of the rainforest. And at their center stood a woman. She was tall and regal, with the same jade-green eyes as Lyra, and a presence that commanded absolute authority. Her face, a mask of serene, implacable fury, was a work of art, a masterpiece of maternal rage. She wore a headdress of iridescent macaw feathers that blazed like a crown of fire in the morning sun. She looked down at the scene below, her eyes locking on Silas Kane with an intensity that promised a slow and very painful death. Then her gaze shifted to her daughter. Lyra cried out a single word, a word that was a prayer, a celebration, and a name. Tiamat. Her mother had come, but she had not come alone. She had brought with her 50 of her tribe's most elite warriors. And they had not come for a rescue, they had come for a reckoning. The bubble of Thea's small, isolated world had not just been pierced, it had been obliterated. She was standing at the epicenter of a clash of civilizations, a war that had been simmering in the shadows and was now about to explode into the light. The vulture had been caught in a trap of his own making, and Thea, the lonely widow, who had only wanted to save a child, was now a witness to the awakening of a power she could never have imagined. The real drama was just beginning. The silence in Echo Canyon was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the promise of imminent violence. The 50 Inti-Tiamat warriors stood like stone sentinels on the canyon rim, their spears and arrows aimed with unnerving precision at the three men below. Silas Kane, for the first time in his long, bloody career, was outmaneuvered. He was a predator, caught in a snare, his cold, calculating mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him. His two hired guns were on the verge of panic. Their bravado had evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. They looked from the silent army above to Silas, their eyes pleading for an order, a plan, a way out of this waking nightmare. Tiamat, the queen of the sun serpent, people raised her hand. It was a simple, elegant gesture, yet it carried the weight of absolute command. The low, rumbling sound that had preceded their arrival, a sound Thea now recognized as the rhythmic stamping of feet on the earth, ceased. The silence returned, even more profound than before. Then Tiamat spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it resonated through the canyon, a melodic, powerful current of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. She spoke in her own language, her words directed not at Silas, but at her daughter. It was a torrent of question and relief, of love and of fury. Lyra answered her own voice once, a child's now imbued with a new strength, a new authority. She recounted her story, her words painting a vivid picture of the ambush, her escape, and her rescue at the hands of the strange, pale woman who had shown her kindness. As she spoke, she gestured towards Thea, and Tiamat's jade-green eyes, so like her daughter's, settled on the widow for the first time. It was a look of intense, penetrating scrutiny, a weighing and measuring of her soul. Thea felt stripped bare, her every motive, every action laid open for this warrior queen to see. She stood her ground, her fear mingled with a strange sense of awe. When Lyra finished, Tiamat's gaze shifted back to Silas Kane. The look of scrutiny was gone, replaced by a cold, implacable judgment. She said a single word, a sharp, guttural command, and the canyon exploded into motion. It was not a chaotic charge. It was a display of disciplined, terrifying precision. Ropes expertly woven from vines snaked down the canyon walls. The warriors descended, not with the clumsy haste of untrained men, but with the fluid, silent grace of spiders. They landed on the canyon floor without a sound, fanning out, encircling the three terrified men in a closing ring of spears and arrows. Silas, to his credit, did not panic. He was a cornered animal, but a dangerous one. He raised his rifle, his eyes darting, looking for a weak point, an opening. But there was none. He was surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered. One of the hired guns, his nerve finally breaking, made a fatal mistake. He raised his rifle and fired a wild shot towards the canyon wall. The sound, deafening in the enclosed space, was an act of desecration in this sacred place. The response was instantaneous. Before the echo of the gunshot had faded, an arrow fletched with brilliant green feathers materialized in the man's chest. He looked down, a comical expression of surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap, his life extinguished in an instant. The other gunman, seeing his companion fall, dropped his rifle and threw his hands in the air, babbling pleas for mercy. Two warriors seized him, disarming him with brutal efficiency and forcing him to his knees. Now, only Silas remained. He stood alone in the center of the circle of warriors, his rifle still held at the ready, his cold, denim-blue eyes locked on Tiamat, who was now descending into the canyon herself, moving with the unhurried, regal grace of a true monarch. "This is a mistake," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was speaking to Tiamat, but his words were meant for Thea, a desperate attempt to find an interpreter, a mediator. "There are powerful men who want this girl, men who will not be happy about this. They will send more, an army of them." Thea, understanding his intent, hesitated, but before she could speak, Tiamat answered for her. She had reached the canyon floor and was now walking towards Silas, her entourage of warriors parting before her like the sea. She stopped a few feet from him and spoke not in her own tongue, but in a heavily accented but perfectly clear Spanish. "We know of your powerful men," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "We have been fighting them since your grandfather's grandfathers first came to this land with their sickness and their greed. They are not new, and they are not invincible." Silas was stunned into silence. The myth of the undiscovered people, the primitive savages he had been hunting, was a lie. These people were not ignorant. They were ancient, they were organized, and they were multilingual. "The girl, Lyra, is not for sale," Tiamat continued, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "She is the future of our people, the Inti-Tiamat. And this land," she swept her arm encompassing the canyon, the forest, the very sky above them, "is not yours to plunder. It is our mother, our temple, our home. We have watched you, Alistair Finch, and your metal serpent, carving its way across the plains. We know what you seek, but the heart of the mother is not for you. It will be your grave." The name Alistair Finch, spoken by this Amazonian queen, sent a chill down Thea's spine. The conflict was no longer a secret. The battle lines were being drawn. "You have no idea what you're up against," Silas snarled, a last desperate threat. Tiamat smiled, a slow, terrifying smile. "No," she said, "it is you who has no idea." She gave another sharp command in her own language. Two warriors, their bodies painted with the fearsome likeness of a jaguar, stepped forward. They moved with a speed that was almost a blur. Silas tried to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow. One warrior knocked the gun from his hands, while the other slammed the butt of his spear into the back of Silas's knee. The bounty hunter cried out in pain and collapsed, his leg buckling beneath him. The warriors seized him, binding his hands with a ruthless efficiency. The vulture, the relentless hunter, the man who had inspired fear throughout the territory, was now a helpless captive, his face contorted in a mask of pain and humiliation. The immediate threat was over, but the crisis was far from resolved. Tiamat turned her attention back to Thea. She walked towards her, her expression unreadable. Thea's heart pounded in her chest. Had she just exchanged one captor for another? Tiamat stopped in front of her. She was taller than Thea, and radiated an aura of raw, untamed power that was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. For a long moment she just looked at her jade-green eyes searching, probing. Then, to Thea's utter astonishment, she reached out and gently touched the scar on Thea's cheek, a faint, silvery line from a childhood accident. It was a gesture of unexpected intimacy, of connection. Then she did something even more unexpected. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head in a gesture of profound respect. "You saved my son, my star," she said, her Spanish soft and melodic. "You saved my Lyra. The Inti-Tiamat do not forget a debt. Your life is now bound to ours. You are under our protection." Thea was speechless. The relief was so overwhelming, it was dizzying. But this was not a celebration. Not yet. Tiamat's expression hardened as she turned to survey her captives. She issued a series of commands, and her warriors began to prepare for a journey. They were not returning to their hidden city. They were preparing for war. "Alistair Finch will not stop," Tiamat said to Thea, as if reading her thoughts. "He will send more men. They will come with their fire and their steel, and they will try to burn our world to the ground. We have fought them in the shadows for many years. Now we will fight them in the light." She looked towards the entrance of the canyon, her gaze fixed on the distant plains where Finch's railroad was a creeping, inexorable scar on the landscape. "But we will not fight them alone," she said, a new, determined light in her eyes. She turned back to Thea. "Your people, the settlers, they do not know Finch. They see his railroad and they see progress. They do not see the greed that drives him. They do not know that once he has taken our gold, he will take their land, their water, their future. He will devour everything in his path." It was a truth that resonated deep within Thea. She had seen the arrogance of the railroad men, their casual disregard for the settlers who had been there for years. She had heard the stories of ranchers being pushed off their land, of water rights being stolen. "You will be our voice," Tiamat said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "You will go to your people. You will tell them what you have seen. You will tell them of the coming storm. An alliance must be forged. The people of the sun and the people of the dust. Together we can fight this metal serpent. Alone we will all be consumed." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. An alliance between the reclusive, mythical Inti-Tiamat and the hard-bitten, fearful settlers of redemption. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, as Thea looked at this incredible woman, at the fierce, disciplined army at her command, at the loving, grateful eyes of Lyra, she knew that it was their only hope. Her simple act of compassion had led her here to this moment, to this precipice of history. She was no longer just a widow, a survivor. She was a bridge between two worlds, a messenger, a warrior in her own right. The journey was not over. In fact, it had just begun. She had to return to redemption, to face the skepticism and the fear of her own people, and convince them to stand with a tribe of painted warriors against the inexorable, corrupting power of the modern world. The fate of the territory of two peoples rested on her shoulders. The real Wild West drama was about to unfold, not in a hidden canyon, but in the dusty streets of a town called Redemption. Thea's journey from a grief-stricken widow to a pivotal leader marks the true beginning of our story. She carried the fate of two peoples on her shoulders, a testament to the fact that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. The alliance she forged between the settlers and the Inti-Tiamat, a bond of shared desperation and newfound respect set the stage for a confrontation that would redefine the very soul of the frontier. This wasn't just a battle for land or gold. It was a fight for the future, a struggle against a tide of ruthless ambition that threatened to wash away their worlds. What did you think of Thea's incredible transformation and the Queen's powerful arrival? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of unlikely heroes and epic conflict moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a real drama, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of history. Your support allows us to keep telling these incredible stories.